Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Where Does It Come From podcast. I'm really happy today to be talking about a subject that I know a lot of people are interested in and have questions about. And I have two experts here on leather. So, first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Alice and Sarah from British Pasture Leather. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very
Thank
much for
you.
having us.
First of all, would you like to introduce yourselves? I don't know who'd like to go first. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into leather and what you're doing now. Who wants to go first?
Go for it, Sarah.
Oh, sure. Yeah, great. Well, I'm Sarah Grady, and my background was not in leather or fashion or even really in food and agriculture. I studied filmmaking and art and theater, and that got me into media production. I worked in educational media production for a long time, but really wanted to do work that was closer to nature. So I began learning a lot about food systems and farming, and that allowed me to work creatively on projects related to sustainable agriculture and regenerative agriculture. And in that course of learning, I asked a lot of questions about how we raise animals for food and how we can do that in the way that is humane and ecological. And it's always been my belief that if we're raising animals for food, we need to use all parts of the animals meaningfully. So I started asking a lot of questions about what happened to the hide. And it was those questions and that curiosity that eventually led into this collaboration with Alice.
Wonderful. Alice, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Alice Robinson. My background is in fashion design. I always wanted to go into designing clothing. I studied women's wear at the London College of Fashion, and I did my BA in women's wear at Edinburgh College of Art. And it was in that process of understanding more about the sort of like the scale and how do I describe it? It was throughout that process that sort of the obsolescence of fashion landscape became a bit less inspiring for me as someone who had really endeavored to be a part of that industry. And so I still wanted to learn and become a part of it, but I decided to change into accessory design for my master's, and I went to the Royal College of Art to learn how to design what I sort of saw as this emblem of a product that lasted a very long time in handbags and in accessories. And that was when I was introduced to leather as a material that was the most sort of prevalent choice in creating those sorts of items. And then I became really fascinated about the material that I hadn't worked with before, and began to ask a lot of questions around its provenance and how its value was very much tied to how we are sort of valuing fashion goods at the time. So I created a collection really exploring that idea during my MA, where I bought a sheep to create my entire fashion collection. And through that process, I got to see how leather was made for the first time and became sort of so fascinated that I've gone down a rabbit hole ever since, and fortunately found Sarah down that rabbit hole and has been able to continue that exploration to the work we're doing now.
I remember when I first met you, Alice, was, oh, I don't know, quite a few years ago now, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, at one of the festivals of natural fibers when I was chairing a panel and you were representing leather on that panel. And I loved your stories about how you were going to get the hides and talk, basically hassling people, abattoirs and people to get the hide. But I love that there's a slide image I think you have of your collection. If I'm thinking of the right collection, where is it the number of the animal, the animal's number, and that your whole collection was around that?
Yeah, well, I was really fascinated that when leather is used in fashion, the value of that material is then transferred to whatever brand has stamped its name upon it. And although in food and in meat production, there's a huge emphasis put on its provenance as being a huge part of that value. And when we talk about materials like leather that are connected to that food system, that provenance disappears really at the point where that hide is removed from that animal. And so both of my collections was really looking at retaining that information as a part of the embedded value that was behind why these products came into existence in the first place, to really challenge how we are redefining the term of what is valuable and beautiful, and how we can have that as a point of reference and education behind for designers and brands to be able to make choices in what we're producing and how we're working with sort of the producers at the start of that materials journey, which are the farmers. So yeah, everything in both collections was embossed with the ear tag number of those animals, and that was the name of those collections.
I absolutely love that because I mean that's traceability, which is, something I'm passionate about. I know both of you are really passionate about traceability as well. But that idea of the provenance of the actual animal is really valuable because that can get lost completely, can't it?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that is changing quite rapidly at the moment, but historically, leather has um, been well defined as a byproduct of meat production, and that being in a sense that an animal is not raised for the value of its hide, um, because that makes up such a small percentage of the saleable value of a carcass or of an animal. But what Sarah and I are really determined to do is sort of reframe that perspective, and that if we're looking at how we produce food in terms of a farm's in terms of a system perspective, how do we produce food in a way that is good for animal health and human health and ecosystem functions and all the benefits that can come out of working with grazing animals to produce food, then how do we value all of that produce in a way that is has value attached to it? And so instead of valuing them as a byproduct, we're seeing that really as a product of pasture-based agriculture or part of regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, and I would elaborate on that too, just with one of the ideas that motivated a lot of the work that I was doing prior to this collaboration with Alice. So as I mentioned, I was working on projects related to food systems, and that was in the context of a region called the Hudson Valley, which is just north of New York City, where I'm from originally. And the mission of the organization that I was part of was to support a strong regional food system. And we did that in a lot of different ways with farmers, but also with culinary professionals. And one of the ideas that really guided my work and also has informed this work on leather is asking the question, what is this land well suited to produce? Because if we're looking at developing supply chains for products that the land is really meant to grow and meant to offer, then we're working in harmony with those natural systems, and we can build economies that support those natural systems. And that region happens to be a landscape that is not dissimilar to that of the UK in the sense that it's hilly and rocky and it grows grass well. And so ruminant animals, which are meant to eat grass, become important partners in stewarding that landscape, excuse me. And what that means is that the presence of grazing animals actually is benefiting those ecosystems. And that was a really important idea for me because I had actually been vegetarian for many, many years. And learning that and really seeing the beneficial impact of grazing systems that are meant not only to look after the animals and look after the land and the soil, but look after the people, including the farmers, as well as the people who are eating that meat, motivated me to become an omnivore because I wanted to ensure that those farmers could remain economically viable. And I think that that's one of the ideas that guides the work that or the inspiration that I have around this work with leather, which is really looking at this as a regional product, that as a product, it represents this function of looking after the land and looking after the soil because we are working in a region that is very well suited to raising grazing animals.
Really interesting. A project I've just completed actually with Centre for Pastoralism in India. It's very related to this actually because we were looking at the nomadic sheep the shepherds that they walk around, but there's actually been being measurements happening about how that benefits the land and the landscape in terms of carbon capture and all sorts of other community benefits too. So we should probably talk about that offline sometime on that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's really relevant to the work that we're doing because meat is criticized in our cultural discourse because so much of global meat production does have a detrimental effect on natural systems, and on people, and certainly on the welfare of those animals. But that's not the full picture. All meat is not the same. So if we're rejecting meat, or in this case, leather, because we don't want to support those industrial systems, I think that's entirely justifiable. But it misses the nuanced point that there are systems in which livestock are an essential part and can bring benefit. And one of the kind of key points of the work that Alice and I are doing to try to create this supply chain is to bring that nuance into the conversation, to say we should have access to leather that we can feel good about choosing and feel good about using because we know it's had those positive impacts.
For sure. And you bring me on to my next question, actually, which is around, I mean, leather has this hugely long history. I mean, I imagine it goes back, I don't know, thousands and thousands of years across many cultures and many animals and different systems, small community systems and etc. But as you say, there's in the current situation, there are a lot of issues around toxic chemicals, overproduction, etc. Can you outline some of the basically outline the current situation and what the challenges currently are with the leather industry as you see them and what you're doing to address this? It's a big question, I know.
Yeah, that's a really big question. Well, I think it's a question with many layers, is that um on the one hand, as we said, hides have typically been seen as a commodity byproduct to enter a very global system of leather production. So leather production it happens at many different stages. Um, One stage where all of the hair is removed and it's tanned to the majority of leather in the world, around 75% is tanned using a method called chrome tanning. And you can relocate that material at different stages. And that first stage of production of where the hide is prepared for tanning is quite dirty, quite smelly, and has lots of different effluents attached to it, and all stages can have different impacts in terms of sort of ecological damage if water filtration systems and effluent treatment isn't prepared in a way that is really caring for the environment. So one of the challenges is because it's such a global picture of how we produce the material, traceability can be incredibly hard. Accountability can be incredibly hard because different parts of that process are happening at different stages. The sort of glut of hides globally and the decrease in a desire to use leather, I think has many different aspects to it. We've got a rise in a leather-like material that can really service both a customer who wants something to look and feel like leather, but not have the price tag of leather attached to it. And that material can also be produced far more cheaply and also then meets that desire that many people have of, as Sarah said, sort of rejecting an association of a material that is often associated with industrial agriculture, and those traceability systems in order to feel like as the customer or as a brand, you've got accountability and an understanding of what this material has been connected to is incredibly hard because of the opaqueness and the complexity of how the material is produced. But there's so many more things than that, Sarah. You can obviously add.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
think so, Joe. It's a that there's a dissertation in that question, and
Yeah.
and I don't think that we necessarily can give you, a comprehensive picture of the current state of the leather industry. But I would say that from our perspective, because of the globalization that Alice has described, what we've really seen and learned is that the leather industry writ large is married to, industrial agriculture because of those economies of scale in terms of providing that raw material. And then, as Alice said, it moves around the world, is processed in different stages in different places. And so what I think often we don't realize or think about when we have leather shoes or a leather belt or a leather wallet is really, what the history of that product has been, from its origin in some kind of agricultural setting. We can't know, and then multiple stages of processing moving forward. Um, so I think that's one thing that again has really guided kind of our interrogation of that system is we perceive leather as an agricultural product. So we're really trying to position leather as a product of our food system. So the same choices and values that we might bring to choosing our food, we would like to enable all of us, whether we're designers or buyers of leather products, to make those same choices in terms of understanding what the origins and what the impact of that product might have been. But the other thing I would just say that I think is really interesting to know and to consider is the different ways in which leather is processed and made. So most leather in the world is produced using a chrome tanning process. The leather that we're producing is using a different process called vegetable tanning, which uses natural tannins from things like barks and leaves. It doesn't involve vegetables, actually. And so there are kind of broadly speaking, these familiar methods of leather processing, but there's starting to be a lot of innovation around that as well. So back to Alice's earlier point of taking responsibility for the impact of those processing methods by looking at what ingredients are used in that processing or what the potential is for treating the outputs of that process. There's starting to be some interesting innovation there too.
Yeah, but I would also just add to that is that the leather industry in Europe and in the UK is in competition with other material industries that can offer um, a material that's like itself, that sort of performs like it. But and I think, I mean, the majority of leather has been used by the automotive industry for a very long time. And that's really changed because of a customer desire to not have an animal product in their cars. And that has really shifted sort of the view of leather historically being, to your point of it's a material that has just evolved with humans because we have been utilizing it for shelter, for machinery, for footwear, for so many things. And the desirability of this versatile material that is so connected to, you know, it's so abundant because of our food system. We can now sort of change that up and utilize a petrochemical based material that can be produced far more cheaply as well. And as a result, many of the hide yards across the UK that we visit are really struggling to have any type of raw material get into a global market because it's just so competitive now for having that finished leather being desirable in the marketplace with so many sort of cultural and environmental changes happening.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because yeah, it feels like I don't think people, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this episode. I'm not sure that the general public, the messages that are getting out at the moment about leather are the ones that are necessarily the ones that you would say, which is why I wanted you on here, because there's the whole vegan thing, which is a ideology issue, but there's also a perception, I think, among people who are trying to do the right things for the environment that leather isn't so good for the environment. But do you know what I mean? But then if you point out to them that a lot of, probably the majority of the substitutes are petrochemical based, that's kind of I say to people who say to me about avoiding leather because they're vegan, I would say to them, but do you not realize that you're basically using plastic instead then? And that's worse. So it is a really difficult one for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I mean, I think a lot of the work that we have found we need to do and continue to do is really build a kind of fluency and familiarity with leather in its authentic form. Because actually, in a sort of material culture, of kind of recent decades, I don't think we really know sort of true leather very well because even most of the leather that is made from cattle hides that comes into sort of the everyday products that we have in our lives is very highly processed. And in fact, very often is also part plastic because it's coated in polyurethane or has other treatments in it. And so, like one of the things that often happens with more sort of mainstream leather is that the top grain layer is slightly buffed off to standardize it, and then it's printed with an embossed print that looks like an animal grain. And the reason for that is to make it uniform and to standardize it, and actually to remove it of some of its natural character, things like growth marks and scratches. And so, I think there's also a lack of just everyday knowledge and familiarity with real leather that feeds into a lot of that confusion as well.
Mm.
Yeah, and that's like when I first began working with leather is was the most exciting thing. You can go into a leather wholesalers and just see sort of reams and reams and reams of like everything that is described termed leather, but looks just so many different ways. It can be treated sort of, you know, to no limit. And I think when you're wanting to try to answer some of those questions that you just said of, what is a option that is better? What does this look like? It's really hard to actually know what that looks like unless you follow through that process. So part of why I was really interested to buying one animal that was local to me and seeing what that meant. What does that mean in terms of thickness? What does that mean in terms of yield? How does a design process, how does a design in fashion industry or design industry respond to the materials that are local to them or to the food systems that they're wanting to support? And what does that mean for a design practice? Because it doesn't necessarily mean that me doing my MA could make a flowy dress with a long train if I am only utilizing materials that are local to me or are part of working with Malcolm Adams from Charity Farm. His native breed Longhorn cattle have a hide thickness of so much and have scratches because it's been in the woodlands. And so how does that sort of bareness of the material and being able to have that visibility into how it's been processed influence our relationship to the types of materials we're working with, instead of being presented with something that, is also essentially part plastic, and it's very hard to build that sort of understanding of where it's came from.
And again, going back to the original question, really, is it looking at history, the
Mm.
history of leather, it wouldn't have looked like that, would it? I mean, basically, it would have been produced in the local area and it would have been tanned and processed using local things, and leather would have probably been different and had a certain authenticity to it, I suppose, like
Mm.
scratch marks, and it would be relating to a particular area. And I feel like, as with so many other things, we've lost that connection to the authenticity. People want everything. I'm doing a people want, which is very generic, but a lot of people want perfection, or we're educated to think that we want perfection. No scratches, no stretch marks, no nothing. It is leather. You can't deny what it actually is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean the other thing we see in so much of the culture that we all live in here is this drive towards homogeneity, and sameness. And something is actually now perceived. I mean, I personally don't agree with this and I'm not interested in this, but I see it all around us, that things are perceived as more valuable rather if they're the same as the thing that was marketed to you or advertised to you or that was on the shelf in the store.
Yeah.
And I think, we lose a lot in that drive towards sameness, not just character, but if you look at food systems and farming systems, that's how we've lost so much biodiversity, and resilience.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
Like
it's
all
also how much waste is caused,
yeah,
because if you're trying to homogenize something, then you're shedding out everything that doesn't fit in. And if we're doing that, then um, you're incurring so much waste. One of the things that Sarah and I, encountered very early on when we have been really our grading system. So in leather production, you can grade hides at different stages, either to put them through as certain products or to put them as, lower grades that need covering in, treating in different ways in order to enter the market. And our grading specification has been they come from Pasture for Life certified farms, and therefore they look this way. And how do we therefore process them and get them to to a quality where we can really celebrate all of the character and the natural character that are within these hides, and then work with designers who want to celebrate that too. But I think that has a lot to do with being able to have all of that connection all the way back. So something that's been really pivotal for us is being able to bring users of leather, designers and brands onto the farms that we work with and be able to talk about the farming practices that are behind the leather that they're then using, sort of, native breeds often living a very longer life outdoors, sort of environmental factors that are then connected to that material, whether they have been, outwintered in woodlands and have scratches or have bite marks that have healed and things like that. And I think all of that picture is really important to how we view what the material is.
Mm. Yeah, you used the word several times. That is one of my favorite words, which is connection. And I think it's about connecting it all together, but also for the end customer, so that authenticity comes back into shopping, I suppose, if you're going to shop. It's that whole idea, if you're buying something, you know actually what it is that you're buying, and that's why it looks like this and feels like this. Whereas at the moment we're talking about the everything being the same, but there's also this encouragement for people to not be aware of the dirty bit at the end, the bit we love, but the bit where people are actually growing something, making something. And we see this with cotton a lot as well, where people, it has to look the same, the colors have to look the same, it has to feel the same, and that it's a natural product that grows. You want to celebrate the diversity of things rather than having everything exactly the same. But I think we're all in agreement on this.
Well, I think there's a very kind of poignant like challenge that's particular to leather when we're talking about that, because when you actually begin to confront, the story of how leather becomes the material that is so useful and prevalent in our lives, you're forced to confront the fact that, as I said before, it comes from, for the most part, beef production. And that does mean, that there is the fact of killing an animal for food, and that's a whole other conversation around
Yeah.
personal values and choices. But I do think that in some ways it is that fact that has driven the leather industry and the way that we look at leather to be so separated from and so divorced from the realities of food production and agriculture. It's been quite radical in a way for us to step into the leather industry and to say leather is a product of our food system.
Mm.
It's not the way that the industry perceives itself previously. I think things are starting to change there, but it's a provocation to do that.
Mm. It's interesting actually as well, isn't it? Just thinking about it, there's been a real pushback against things like fur. So when you talk to people about fur production and things like that, it's an absolute horror, which I share. So I can put my values out there. But it's interesting that people don't perceive leather in quite the same way, and probably rightly, as fur, But it's still, like you say, leather seats in cars, leather belts, leather shoes. They're
Well, it is different because in the fur industry, at least as I understand it, those animals are raised for their
That's true.
skins and their fur, and that is not the case with leather. And in fact, that's a real misperception that we've been surprised to learn is quite prevalent, that there is often a misunderstanding that leather comes from animals that were raised for their hides, and that's not the case. It would never be practical or economical for a farmer to raise cattle for their hides, that is not how leather is made. So there's quite a profound difference between leather and fur in that way.
Mm. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
and on that point, I mean, when Sarah and I began um, our desire to build a leather supply chain connected to pasture for life cattle hides, we obviously needed to speak to the abattoirs in which those farmers were taking their animals to. And in more than one instance, those abattoirs are of a very small scale. They're in rural locations where those abattoirs can either sell meat directly to the local butcher or give the carcass back to a farm to be able to sell in their own farm shop or direct to their own customer relationships. And because of the challenges that we've described facing the leather industry at the moment, and all hides being lumped into, that having a singular value, many of those hides were going into waste, either having to go into incineration or going into waste disposal because um, because they are all treated as the same. And so the sort of point there being that um, hides are completely valued as a waste product, that either we use them or they go into the bin because that there isn't very differently to fur. There is no farming for leather that isn't for the use of its hide, and that is a really important part of the work that we're doing. And when we look at what's the difference between sort of the economic difference of trying to build a small local supply chain connected to these farms, when we're talking about a global commodity that is at the moment worth very little per unit, but trying to embed a lot of value into it. Leather on the roll, on sort of as it's treated, sort of on the roll, being sort of £1 or £2 per square foot, is like absolutely. I mean, it's mind-bending of how that can happen when that is such a small amount to pay for that material, but it's because we have an abundance of it at the moment.
Market forces. That is a really key point, Alice. Thank you. I think people understanding that leather is a byproduct, I suppose, and it's very different from animals that are raised for their hide or skin is that's really, really key. I hope people pick that one up. Um, okay, I was going to ask you, really, we haven't talked a lot about your business, British Pasture Leather, yet. Which we've gone straight down into this leather conversation, which is
Yeah.
fabulous. So would you like to tell us a little bit about British Pasture Leather and what interesting projects you're working on at the moment?
Do you want me to go first?
I'll take the first half, you take the second. Yes, so British Pasture Leather is the enterprise that we have created over the past few years. It is the first and currently only supply of leather that is traceable to regenerative farms in the UK. So we have done that by aligning ourselves with farms whose practices deliver what we call regenerative outcomes. So they are building the health of soil and the health of the ecosystems. They are looking after the welfare of the animals and they're producing very nutritious, healthy food. And we've created that supply chain by first identifying those farms in partnership with a certification that's delivered by an organization called Pasture for Life, which currently represents the highest standard of certification for livestock agriculture in the UK. And then building that supply chain forward by coordinating, as Alice said, with the abattoirs to segregate those certified hides from the general output of hides from that abattoir. So the hides from those certified farms are the hides that we purchase from the abattoir. And it's often, again, another misconception is that farmers sell the hides of their animals. That's not the case. They're actually sold by the slaughterhouse. We purchase those certified hides. They are then collected and preserved using salt, which is a traditional way to preserve and cure those hides before they can be fully processed. And then we have, fortunately, a very positive relationship with a tannery also in the UK. All of our production is in the UK, that provides us with that vegetable tanning process that I mentioned earlier. The unfinished but tanned hides, when they come out of the tannery, are then relocated to a finishing facility in Northampton, which is a business that we've collaborated with very closely in our development to produce finished styles of leather that are suitable to accessories, footwear, and furniture. So we're really proud of the fact that we've been able to build this supply chain that results in a material that's not only, very durable and beautiful, but has a very versatile application in the context of product design.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. No, it is. I mean, I know how hard it is to build a transparent supply chain, but it's great that there is now, for people in the UK, designers, brands, there is now a source of leather with a full story, and it's been processed sustainably and ethically. I mean, congratulations on that. It's fabulous work.
Yeah, it's been a really fun and ch very challenging journey because we really set out with the goal to produce domestically and using a vegetable tanning method and really produce a material that was a reflection of the values and a true representation of a material that is tied to these pasture for life farms. And that is very different from the norm. So it took a lot of development to really produce this material so it can be adoptable by brands and designers who just are more used to having a lot more choice in terms of, you know, thickness and surface character. And as I said, sort of what we're really wanting to be able to say is that, would you like to work with a material that is connected to our local landscapes and the stewardship of them? This is what it looks like. Like, have fun designing with it. Kind of, this is the product of this community of farms that has been produced here in the UK, and being able to work with some of the few remaining leather facilities in the UK, which are such crucial resources to us and to the design and craft making community, because without them, we can't make this material in the UK. And it's something that is, so tied to British heritage by having, traditional methods of producing leather. So that's been a really exciting development. We've been very, very fortunate to have had a lot of support from the leather industry in this endeavor. And yeah, so we have through our journey last year, we saw the leather sort of enter the marketplace through a few different brand launches. We worked with Billy Tannery, who is another leather producer, sort of in this vanguard of how can we reimagine this material, still staying in the UK, but very connected to all parts of the production chain. So we produced a leather handbag working with Deer Leather as well. And we worked with a knitwear company who has two knitwear companies who have very shared values around the sourcing and the production of their wool. So we worked with Navy Grey and Herd for that. And this week, well, I believe it opens this week. We haven't had a chance to see it yet, but Gale's Bakery have launched a sort of moonshot restaurant cafe where our leather has been used in the upholstery of their seating, and that's one of a few projects where the leather has been used in a food very connected to a food setting. So we Gale's restaurant in Notting Hill, whose chef we have collaborated with before, really championed the work of pasture fly farmers in the meat produce that they source. We've worked with them for their menus and things like that. So we have had a lot of conversations throughout this journey on how can we help produce a material that is suited to a range of different applications, and also answering that desire that we're really hearing from the industry of working with a material with provenance, with total transparency, and sort of that exciting opportunity on, what does that look like? What is it best suited to make? So hopefully we'll have a bit more news on some of those project launches. And I'm sure I've missed many other designers and makers that we've worked with along the way as well.
No, it's fabulous. It's really, really, really interesting. I was going to ask you actually, because you mentioned something about standards, or Sarah did, and regulation. Is there a regulatory framework that you feel needs tightening up in the UK, or something changing in the UK in terms of regulation and standards, or is it a system that's working fine, would you say?
I think there are a lot of new approaches to that are developing that will be very useful in supporting our supply chain. So are you referring to the leather processing?
Yeah, all of the environmentalism, animal health, that kind of stuff.
Right. Well, I mean, so we're embarking on some work with the Sustainable Leather Foundation, which provides a verification and certification protocol to the leather industry broadly. And we're hoping to be working with them to verify and certify our supply chain here in the UK, which would involve a couple of firsts. Namely, the fact that there is no certification right now that is active around finished leather that goes all the way back to the farm level. So ours would be the first if we're able to complete that process, which I believe we will be. And also, the Sustainable Leather Foundation at the moment is not certifying any of the leather manufacturers in the UK. So we're hoping to work with them on that as well. So in terms of how that supply chain is managed in leather production, again, it's really divorced from the agricultural side of it. So the fact that we're coming in with raw material that has a farm certification would then be joined up with the leather supply chain certification. So from a certification point of view, that's how that works. There are regulations coming in that will require traceability and greater accountability in leather material. And again, I think we're going to be very well positioned to provide material that meets those requirements.
Fabulous. I hope that first comes to pass. I'm sure it will do, but it's so lovely to have that full traceability all the way back. And I think it's also something that is setting the standard for others. You're raising the bar high, and I think that other people will see that. And also customers will look at that as well and think, well, if they can do it, why can't other people do it? So I think it's really leading stuff, which is fantastic, really. Um, so well done. The next question is what advice would you give to anyone, consumers, but also businesses and designers who are looking to source leather or leather substitute at the moment?
Yeah, I'll start, but Alice should pick up from her designer perspective. The first thing well, I wanted to add actually to when I was describing our system before, one thing I didn't mention is that we have opted to borrow a term from wine. We have opted to adopt a low intervention approach in the processing in the sense that we're looking as thoughtfully as we can around the choices that we can make as far as what's used in the processing and in the surface coatings of our leather. So as we mentioned before, very often we don't realize that our leather goods have coatings on them that may be plastic, or other synthetic applications. And we're opting not to do that. So what we end up with is a leather that will change as you use it. So, and again, borrowing a term from a colleague of ours who calls that mellowing. So as you use a leather product that's made with a really natural leather, it may darken over time. It may develop a patina, from your handling and use of it. And so, in addition to not erasing the natural character, as we mentioned before, growth marks, scratches, scars, we're also not covering that up or applying something that's going to mean that it will always look the same way. So we're producing a material that's very true to its natural character. And for those of us that I think are familiar with natural materials, that's a point of beauty, and that's an asset, that's a valuable attribute. But for some brands and designers that are more accustomed to a more highly standardized material or a more commodity approach, that's a real challenge. So there, as Alice said before, designing from a perspective of imagining a product and then choosing a material that can go into that product. And so what we're really trying to advocate for in terms of how our leather is used and adopted is the opposite, is get to know the material and what its qualities and characteristics are and design from there. And I'll let Alice pick up from there because that's what her work has demonstrated.
Go, Alice.
I mean, that it's one of the really exciting things with leather is that I mean, and from our close partnership with Blenkinsopps, which is the finishing facility we work with, is there are so many things that you can do to the material. One of the main things that we've opted not to do is to use heavy coatings and polyurethanes and plastics in it. But that doesn't mean that the scope of design approaches any more narrowed. It's a really exciting place to develop upon, really. The question you had around what could we do to advise or share with anyone who's wanting to work in a similar way. I mean, you can now come and visit us because we have a facility which is now next door to Blenkinsopps, the facility we work with. It used to actually be a part of their tanning and finishing facility. Used to be there where they used to dry the hides, and it's gone through many different stages of being a part of an accountant's and part of a craft warehouse. And it's very exciting that it's now been turned back over to being used for leather production. And we're really hoping to be able to use that space to offer an opportunity for designers and people in the leather community to want to be able to have workshops, have a way to have a look at what we're doing. So you can always come visit us. We now have a website where we are offering leather in single pieces. So it was something that I certainly experienced while studying is that any sort of material innovation or something coming to market, it's like it can only be accessed by, the people at the top of the industry who can buy 10,000 square feet. And I think Sara and I felt really strongly that we wanted to be able to curate this sort of value chain to be able to produce this material so that it can then be accessible to any user of and maker with leather at any scale. And so we are wanting to be able to offer that as well. And I'm not too sure what else I
No,
can.
that's great. I love your point. Do you know, when Sarah was speaking, I was thinking exactly the same thing about design. I think that there needs to be something in the design education process where people no longer design something and then say, okay, what are the materials I can use to create my vision? It's got to be I believe it's got to be much more now about what are these beautiful opportunities around different fabrics, different materials, and then what can I do with them? What is to show their beauty?
Yeah,
Mm,
and I think, for me, I think the piece of advice would be, to educate ourselves about the impacts in the raw material production. And so when you come on one of our field days or visit a farm that's in the Pasture for Life network that we are partnered with, you have the opportunity to learn and to appreciate, as we said before, how the role of those animals on their farms is delivering tremendous benefits. With the list is long, increasing biodiversity, supporting ecosystem function, increasing soil health, supporting, rural communities and farm viability. And when you look at the leather that we're producing through that lens, things like scratches or other, variations in the material become moments when we can celebrate the fact that the life that animal lived on that farm brought positive benefits, to our landscapes and to our culture, rather than using the language that is very common in the leather industry to say that that's a flaw or an imperfection. And so really, I think starting with an understanding of those agricultural systems that yield natural fibers and materials, and then, really interrogating and asking why do we use the language that we use to describe the qualities of those natural materials, in a way that either undervalues or devalues or criticizes things that actually are very positive.
Yeah, and sort of on that around education and resources, Pasture for Life has an open membership, so anyone can become a member of Pasture for Life. They have a certification for the farms, but members include sort of chefs, bakers, educational institutions, designers, anyone
Mm.
any citizen can be a part of a member of Pasture for Life. And another really inspiring part of our year now is Groundswell, the agricultural conference that happens in June every year. And sort of more and more we've seen in the last few years is seeing the discourse around fibers that are a part of our agricultural system being you're really having a stage at Groundswell. And so we've been a part of that conference for the last few years, and we've had Mulberry and Doc Martens and many other people within the industry being able to come and speak to farms, learn more about what often we only have access behind a screen. And so that's a really great place to community build around the conversation as well. And it's always a very inspiring few days. So
Amazing.
having that on anyone's calendar would be good.
Yeah, I'd love to see some Doc Martens made of British pasture
I
leather.
know.
That
Wouldn't
would
we
be
all?
awesome. I would definitely buy some of those for sure. Okay, that's brilliant. So the last thing really is, where can people find you? You've mentioned your website. Are you on social media? How would you like to be contacted by these new aspiring designers and customers?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you can find us on Instagram, and there's email address on our website as well.
So get in touch with Alice and Sarah. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been absolutely fascinating and a real education for me, especially because my background is much more about the sort of grown fibers side of things. So I'm just getting into wool a little bit now with a project I've been doing over the last year, but leather is like a whoo, nothing really at all on it. So it's fascinating, especially as a vegetarian. So it's quite interesting to learn about how it all fits together with with the whole ecosystem, which is I'm obviously passionate about. So thank you again for joining us. I've got to say another thank you. The Where Does It Come From podcast has been picked by FeedSpot as one of the top 50 UK sustainability podcasts. So I'm really happy about that. Thank you very much, FeedSpot, for that one. I think we were quite high on the list as well. I'm not sure if it was a ranked list or but just ran.
congratulations.
Oh, yeah, it's
Yeah,
great when you're
congrats.
on it. You're part of this. It started as a hobby in lockdown, and I enjoy these conversations so much, and I know other people do too. So I'm just going to keep doing it while there's conversations to be had, and I think there are lots of them. Anyway, thank you so much for your time and for joining us, and yeah, thank you everyone for listening to the Where Does It Come From podcast.
Thank you, Joe.